Hi student, welcome to Psychology of Art class again, and here in this lecture video, I will present the topic of art perception and cognition. So here are the subtopics that will be covered in this video. All right, to open up our discussion in this topic, we basically understand that aesthetic phenomena, or in other words, art experiences, are certainly among the most complex phenomena to be able to explain by behavioral sciences. Thus, investigating and explaining art through the lens of behavioral science cannot be done by using single perspective. And in this lecture, I will try to explore the human perception and cognition related to arts. So let's begin with definition. I believe that you still remember we study about perception in our cognitive psychology class in your early semester. So what is perception? So perception is defined as experiences resulting from stimulation of the senses. So before moving further to understand about perception, we can distinguish sensation from perception. So basically, sensation is input about the physical world obtained by our sensory receptors. For example, we see picture of object by our eyes and we hear sound by our ears, and etc. It is basically detecting basic sensory features such as visual form in the dark and brightness, also colors and contrasts, and etc. While perception is the process by which the brain or our mind will select, organize, interprets all of these sensations. In other words, senses are the physiological basis of perception. Therefore, all human perception is mediated by lower level cognitive process, starting from sensation in our sensory system, in which further process through the perception. Likewise, art perception and art production also constrained by how the human brain and mind work. Thus, we need to re-examine how our brain works, which causes our mind to process the perception of art. All right, so let's talk about the perception at first. As you might remember, that perception processing can be done by two ways. The first one is the bottom-up processing. It involves information, in addition to the foundation that provided by activation of the reception. So when the environment or stimuli here it will influence our thinking, that is the bottom-up processing. So in this process, our brain then interpret these sensory signals. In the contrary, perception also involves factors such as personal knowledge of the environment and the expectation that people bring to the perceptual situation. For example, as you can see in this picture, an experiment by Palmer showed that people will identify a rapidly flashed object in a kitchen scene more accurately when the object fits the scene. So this knowledge we have of the environment is the basis of top-down processing, or the processing that originates in the brain at the top of the perceptual system. So it is the knowledge that enables people to rapidly identify objects and scene, and also to go beyond mere identification of object to determining the story behind that scene. So another example also shown in this picture, this blurry picture. So when we see a blurry picture or the blob in a image here, without environmental context, we might having difficulty in perceiving it. However, when the blob presented with also blurry background, our mind will draw a conclusion based on our previous knowledge that this kind of shape, even though it is also blurred, is people sitting behind table. And thus, this blob might be a bottle on top of the table. So let's consider of the example of top-down processing of visual art. In this painting by Van Gogh, when we using our bottom-up processing, we might see some colors, brightness, and contrast, and thus we perceive that this is a blue-yellow tone pictures with some ricochet surface. But when we use our top-down processing, our art perception will be completed using our prior knowledge and experiences of seeing water, seeing ocean, and seeing human before, we can understand objects in these paintings, even though it is not clear or a bit blurry. So to understand more about art perception, how we perceive art, and why visual art looks appealing for us to see, let's overview some concepts in human object perception, including Helmholtz's theory of unconscious inference, the Gestalt Law of Organization, and regularities in the environment. The first, according to Helmholtz, human vision is incomplete and ambiguous. Our eyes have limitation, thus we cannot detect object in a whole. Therefore, we need our mind to complete the incomplete or ambiguous picture to be able to see in more detail. Yeah, so for example, in this picture, it is not clear enough, it is ambiguous. It consists of black and white contrast colors. But then if we use our unconscious inference to organize this black and white shade, then we can perceive this object as a head of a cow. So does with paintings. Even though picture in paintings is ambiguous, yeah, our mind inferences will complete it so we can relate to the paintings and we can make meaning about it. So our mind makes assumption about what is going on and then decides to complete the object that we see. We just can't help it, and it happened automatically, right? All right, so the next explanation is the object perception through Gestalt Law of Organization. So Gestalt psychology was founded by German thinkers, yeah, Wertheimer, Kohler, and Kafka, and they focused on how people interpret the world. So the Gestalt perspective formed partially as response to the structuralism of Wilhelm Wundt, yeah, who focused on breaking down mental events and experiences to the smallest elements. So in visual art, the sensation that is represented by dots actually were accumulated to create perception. So for example, in this picture of this face picture, it consists of structured dots, yeah, and those we perceive it as a human face, as we can see it as a structured or organized dots. As well as this lower picture, we can see that this is also dots, black and white. But then when we structure these dots, then we can see it as a Dalmatian. All right, so Gestalt Law of Organization has several principles that we will discuss some of them here and then relate them to the art perception. So please notice that this law on how people perceiving their world can be used as principle in making artwork, designs, and etc. Yeah. The first one is the expression theory in Gestalt. Explain that perception of art expression is direct and not mediated by anything else. For example, we perceive this painting expressed warmness and lively, yeah, because of the color that the painters use, and it is not mediated by anything else. And the next principle of Gestalt is symmetry and balance. So people tend to think of object as symmetrical shapes, yeah, that forms around their center. This is why we perceive something that is symmetrical as beautiful. So symmetry actually builds a sense of solid and organized. So psychologically, human actually seek for balance and push regularity on chaos. And this principle makes us wanting balance in any composition. Yeah, even though the composition is not perfectly symmetrical, but we still perceive balance and harmonious as attractive object. And the next principle is the law of pregnance. The word pregnance is a German term meaning good figure. So the law of pregnance is sometimes referred to as the law of good figure or the law of simplicity. So this law holds that objects in the environment are seen in a way that makes them appear as simple as possible. You see this image of Olympic symbols. as overlapping circles, right? Rather than assortment of curved, connected lines. So psychologically, we tend to like things that are simple, clear, and organized because instinctively, this is more safe. So simple things need less time to process and not having extra surprises, and also tend to be less dangerous. If we present it by complex objects, we tend to reorganize them into simpler components or simpler whole. Yeah. So when we see the Olympic symbols here, we tend to see it as five circles rather than nine odd objects. In art, for example, we can use this law of pregnance principle for designing logos. The simpler, the more eye-catching it is. All right, next, the law of continuity also holds that point that are connected by straight or curving line are seen in a way that follows the smoothest path. Rather than seeing separate lines and angles, lines are seen as belonging together. And the next important principle is the similarity principles. So the law of similarity here suggests that similar things tends to appear grouped together. And grouping can occur in both visual and auditory stimuli. So this example in the B image, you probably see the groupings of colored circles as rows, yeah, rather than just a collection of dots. So does this picture of woman by the beach, showing that color grouping influence our perception. All right, let's move to the third object perception concept is the regularities in the environment. So regularities in the environment are characteristic of the environment that occurs frequently. And physical regularities are regularly occurring physical properties of the environment. For example, there are more vertical and horizontal orientation in the environment than oblique or angled orientation, right? And this occurs in a human-made environment as well. For example, in buildings, yeah, they contain a lot of horizontal and verticals, and also in natural environments. Trees and plants are more likely to be vertical or horizontal rather than slanted. It is therefore no coincidence that people can perceive horizontals and verticals more easily than other orientation. And then another type of regularities in the environment is the semantic regularities. Yeah, it is the characteristic associated with the functions carried out in the different type of scenes. So in language, semantics here revert to the meanings of word or sentences. Yeah, when it applied to perceiving scenes, semantics here revert to the meaning of a scene. This meaning is often related to what happens within a scene. For example, food preparation, cooking, and perhaps eating. Yeah, it occurs in a kitchen. And semantic regularities are the characteristic associated with the function carried out in different type of scenes. So although people make use of regularities in the environment to help them perceive, they are often unaware of the specific information they are using. That's why even though we may not think about regularities in visual scene, we use them to help perceive scenes and the object within scenes. All right, we're just evaluating some perception and object perception theories in cognitive psychology. Yeah. So it can be understood that art perception is actually more complex and complicated than just perceiving object in our environment. So art perception will need more complex series of different level of perceptual organization. For example, when we are enjoying paintings, yeah, we will need sets of object perception concept, not just one, yeah. Also beyond perception itself, it needs further cognitive process. So to explain briefly about cognitive process in arts after the reception process here, that in which incorporating sensation and perception, further analysis process and synthesis process will be happening in our mind or our cognition as well. Through the analysis process, the component of object that we perceive will be separated and analyzed separately. We will process the color, the shape, the location in one pictures, yeah, for example. And further, we will continue with the synthesis process in which our brain will create representation of art objects that we have analyzed and also will incorporate the attention function in our mind be able to create full picture of those artistic objects. So in the previous slide, we explained briefly about cognitive approaches to art. So from the perception part, we understand that humans tend to have some principle, right, in perceiving their environment and objects in their environment. However, successful visual art that is appealing to our perception and attention, usually because it contains exaggeration of appropriate features that human perception is attuned. For example, the color, the contrast, the contour, the shapes, and etc. And it must be something that's striking in that visual art form that considered as a successful visual art. And art offer unusual way of representing ideas, right? So it requires cognitive ability to give meaning to the art products. So our cognition is a constructive process, right, that facilitate us to develop out art representation in our mind. It is involving our sensory sensation as well as our experience. So art is also closely related to creativity, which is also an important topic of research in cognitive psychology. And creativity is basically a mental phenomenon that engage multiple cognitive processes, yeah, to generate novel and useful solution of problems. So artists, largely known as a creative person, those their ability or characteristic such as divergent thinking, fluency, flexibility, originality is studied to explain about creativity. So we will discuss more about creativity in the topic of neuroscience and art in our next two class. All right, so there are actually two aspects in understanding art through the cognitive approaches, yeah. So there are aesthetic and meaning. So aesthetic here aspect involve as aesthetic appreciation towards the art, in which we perceive art as beautiful or interesting or appealing or evoking our senses and etc. Later, we also give meaning to the artworks, in which further cognitive processes uh, involved there and can be explained by the theory of SEMA. So further explanation on how we make meaning can be learned by another important concept of cognitive psychology, in which explaining schemata or mental images. Yeah. So our cognition, it construct and manipulate mental representation of our outside world. True. In which it is involving existing conceptual framework that we possess. So schema here is the term of a person framework in giving meaning to objects, to incidents, or other people. And schema here can be changed. It is depending on our experiences with our environment. And schema here are cognitive structure that is representing generic knowledge. For example, structure which do not contain information about particular entities, yeah, instance or event, but rather about their general form. For example, your schema for your friend might include information about her appearance, her behaviors, her personality, and her preferences. And then there's also another schema that is social schema. It will include general knowledge about how people behave in certain social situation. And schema or mental images here affected by the process of assimilation and accommodation. So assimilation is the interpretation and response toward environment. Yeah. So while accommodation is the concept of modification for adaptation to the environment. So this concept can be used to explain the process of giving meaning towards art creation or art forms. So the way we interpret paintings, for example, involving assimilation as we adjust our perception about the art that we see, so that can fit into our schema or things that we are already know. We cannot interpret something into a form that we don't know before, right? But we keep the new information about the painting and add it to knowledge that we have in our mind. So we can also do accommodation when we restructure or modify that what we already know about something related to the artwork. We modify it yeah, so that the new information uh, can fit better in our schema. All right, guys, so that's all about art perception and cognition. Thank you so much for your attention, and see you soon.